This is Tom Fox, and I'd like to welcome you to a new season of the award-winning Adventures in Compliance, the podcast where we look at the Sherlock Holmes short stories, movies, novels, and related material from the angle of compliance. The Case-Book of Sherlock Holmes is the final set of 12 out of a total of 56 Sherlock Holmes short stories published by Arthur Conan Doyle. These were published, of course, in the Strand Magazine between October 1921 and April 1927. The books, are two of the short stories, The Adventure of the Veiled Lodger and The Old Shuscombe Old Place, were the last of the Sherlock Holmes works protected by copyright. Although some of the stories are comparable with earlier works, many people feel that this is a lesser offering of Holmes, to which I wholeheartedly disagree. I hope that you will join us for this exploration of the final collected works of Sherlock Holmes as we take a deep dive literally into business ethics, leadership, investigative strategies, pattern recognition, and perhaps even portending the use of AI and generative AI as a tool for the compliance professional. There are some great stories in here, and I know you will enjoy them, and I hope you will enjoy this season of Adventures in Compliance really as much as I've enjoyed reading the stories. If you've enjoyed this award-winning series or any of the Sherlock Holmes works, I hope you will subscribe or rate and review to this podcast series, Adventures in Compliance. This podcast series contains promotional material throughout the podcast. We're going to have a quick word from our network sponsor, Ethico, then we'll be right back.
If you're a compliance officer, middle managers are crucial in getting your programs from you to your frontline employees. But how do we activate those managers and get them on our side? Ethico's new Middle Manager Toolkit equips you with the skills needed to empower your managers, to promote a culture where ethical behavior thrives and employees feel empowered to speak up. Learn how to turn frontline managers into ethical leaders with our new white paper, Empowering Middle Managers as Ethics Champions. And did I mention you can get the whole toolkit for free? Head to ethico.com to download the full toolkit today.
Also, if you are looking for something new and different for the upcoming Compliance Week celebration in November, check out The Compliance Kids. It's my 3-book children's series on compliance and compliance professionals for children, but they make great gifts and great training tools for your employees. You can check it out on Amazon.com. We've linked to it in the show notes. Today, we begin an exploration of the final book or volume of collected Sherlock Holmes stories, and it is, of course, the Case-Book of Sherlock Holmes, which was released in 1927. Fear, Conan Doyle wrote in the preface to that book, I fear that Sherlock Holmes may become one of those popular tenors who, having outlived their time, are still tempted to make repeated farewell bows to their indulgent audiences. This must cease, and he must go the way of all flesh, imaginary or material. His career has been a long one, Doyle continued, a striking example of both the patience and loyalty of the reading public. But the time had come to bid Holmes farewell. I thank you for your past consistency and can hope that some return has been made in the shape of the distraction from the worries of life, the stimulating change of thought, which can only be found in the fairy kingdom of romance. Conan Doyle had spent his career writing about anything that took his fancy. A vast corpus of occult and supernatural tales can be numbered among that corpus of work. A lot of nonsense as well, as he devoted the last decade of his life or so to singing the praises of spiritualism, spirit photography, and almost any other fanciful notions that 20th century tomfoolery could fling at him. His interest in the supernatural was not unexpected. It can be traced back through his writings of more than a few years. Back in 1892, for example, he was among 24 authors who contributed chapters to the magnificent literary conceit entitled The Fate of Vanilla, each writing one chapter apiece and winding up with a novel of deliciously prosperous Gothic pretension. Bram Stoker, future creator of Dracula, also numbered among this august band. Doyle wrote of shipboard spirits and earthbound horrors, and of course Sherlock Holmes had his own brushes with the inexplicable, not the least of which was the quasi-werewolf that is the hound of the Baskervilles. Yet by the 1920s, Conan Doyle could stretch his normally good-tempered audience's credulity to the limit. Early in 1923, Doyle's attention was brought to bear on some remarkable occurrences taking place in Yorkshire, where two schoolgirls, Elsie Wright and her cousin Frances Griffin, had apparently taken the first ever genuine photographs of fairies that lived at the bottom of their garden. Time and science bore out these girls to be frauds, and indeed an elderly Elsie Wright's own confession proved this, but Doyle continued to believe. The shifting interest and indeed purpose through many of Sherlock Holmes' stories that appeared in the 1920s. A dozen tales purporting to be adventures that Watson had not heretofore documented were published in the Strand, but almost all, without exception, were as weak as any in the canon. At least some people think that. Conan Doyle had never been especially secretive of the fact he wrote for money. Nothing wrong with that. And his outrageous fees he was able to command were a point of pride for him. I think it really doesn't matter whether he wrote them for a lot of money, no money, or some money. There are some pretty good stories in this final book, and we're going to explore each one of them. Each one of those stories is someone's favorite, including Conan Doyle, who found many of them to be at least the equal of his past tales. In fact, there are more than a few that are actually quite good. We're going to explore each one of these in this series, the Case-Book of Sherlock Holmes. I hope you will join me in this entire exploration as we continue our journey on the intersection of Sherlock Holmes and compliance in the podcast series, Adventures in Compliance. Thanks so much for listening. Next week, we begin with the Marrow's Stone. This is Tom Fox again. Thank you so much for listening to this introduction to the final collected works of Sherlock Holmes, the Case-Book of Sherlock Holmes. As I mentioned at the start of this podcast, Ethico is the Compliance Podcast Network sponsor, and their management toolkit is a great tool for you to use. It's available free, and check out the link in the show notes for more information on it. If you're a Holmes fan or you enjoy analogizing to compliance, leadership, and ethics, this is the podcast series for you. I hope you will take the opportunity to reread one or perhaps all of the short stories. They're short reads and a lot of fun. I'm going to be taking a deep dive into each one of them, looking at leadership lessons, ethical lessons, and or compliance lessons from each one. If you're a Sherlock Holmes aficionado like myself, I'd love to visit with you about some of your favorite stories and perhaps record a podcast or two with you on them. So please contact me. You can reach me through the website of the Compliance Podcast Network. Adventures in Compliance is a special production of the Compliance Podcast Network. And as I mentioned, we are sponsored this month by Ethico. So I hope you will check out the Ethico white paper that's available through their special link on that we put in the show notes that I mentioned earlier. This is Tom Fox. I'm greatly looking forward to the return of Sherlock Holmes. Join us next week when we begin our exploration of the Case-Book of Sherlock Holmes by looking at the Marrow's Stone.